Good afternoon. On behalf of CBIA and our sponsor, the law firm of Carmody Torrance, I would like to thank you for joining us for this webinar. For businesses today, there probably isn't an issue which causes more pronounced anxiety for managers and employees than violence in the workplace. The incidents experienced by far too many while they're simply trying to earn a living has heightened our awareness of these dangers and the violent individuals who commit them. We are fortunate enough to have with us two speakers, Nick Zaino and Mike Miele, who will explore this issue from a number of different perspectives: the legal, company policies, and the defensive measures to consider both in preparation and if we are faced with violence on the job. Before we begin the presentation, I'd like to point out that due to time restraints, we ask that you submit your questions in a question and answer panel, and the speakers will address them at the end of their respective presentations. Our first speaker today is Nick Zaino. Nick Zaino is a partner with Carmody Torrance in the company's business services group, where he is the co-practice group leader. He practices primarily in the area of labor and employment law and has extensive experience in counseling, representing, and training employers on all aspects of the employment relationship. Nick's clients range from the small to large companies in various industries, such as banking, medical, education, manufacturing, engineering, retail, construction, and a nonprofit. Please join me in welcoming Nick Zaino.
Thank you very much, Phil, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We have today sort of a heavy topic, but a really important one. I think we all agree, and certainly the pandemic has reminded us that workplace safety is a top priority of every employer. And sadly, we've seen many high-profile incidents of gun violence across the country recently, including a number of mass shootings. In fact, the Washington Post reported that as of July 5, 2022, there were over 300 mass shootings in the United States. And a number of these incidents have occurred in the workplace. For example, the mass shooting that occurred at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York, left 10 dead, including 4 employees of that supermarket. And according to Osha, acts of violence are the 3rd leading cause of fatal occupational injuries in the United States. In 2020, there were 651 fatal injuries that were caused by workplace violence. And every year, approximately 2 million employees are victims of workplace violence. So those are quite alarming numbers for employers. And given this rise in workplace violence and just violence in general, our goal today is really to get you thinking about your policies and your practices concerning safety, and specifically around workplace violence. As Phil mentioned, we will start by reviewing some of your legal obligations, and I'll walk through that. And then we'll provide you some guidance and practical steps that you could take to mitigate the risks of violence in the workplace. And Mike will really lead us through that discussion. At the end of the day, I think your goal and our goal for you is that we want you to be comfortable that you're doing everything that you reasonably can do as an employer to protect your employees and to mitigate your legal risk. So with that, let's get started on the legal review. And OSHA, of course, is the federal agency that's responsible for enforcing federal workplace safety laws. Currently, OSHA does not have a specific standard on what employers must do to mitigate the risk of workplace violence. And that's probably because there are so many different types of workplaces out there that it would be very difficult to establish a standard. So what OSHA does is they investigate incidents of workplace violence under the General Duty Clause of the OSHA Act, which is quoted on that slide. That general duty clause does not create a private cause of action, so an employee could not bring a claim directly under the general duty clause. It can only be enforced by OSHA. And to prove a violation of the general duty clause, OSHA needs to show a couple things. It needs to show that the employer failed to render its workplace free of a hazard. That particular hazard was recognized. The hazard caused or was likely to cause death or serious physical harm. And there was a feasible and useful method to correct that particular hazard. So they apply that standard for workplace violence, and there is a safe harbor for what is known as an unpreventable employee misconduct. And that safe harbor applies, and therefore the employer will not be found liable if the employer can show that it established work rules designed to prevent the violation, it adequately communicated those rules to its employees, it's taken steps to discover violations of those work rules, and the employer effectively enforced the rules when violations were discovered. So these are obviously just general guidelines for you to think about and consider. OSHA has published, and I have it on the screen, what's called enforcement procedures and scheduling for occupational exposure to workplace violence. What that is the document that OSHA inspectors will use in evaluating a claim of workplace violence under the general duty clause. And it's easy to find that document on the internet, you literally just type in that title and it'll pop right up, and we can also provide you a link. But the inspector will look at, the employer's workplace violence prevention program. What is your policy? What are your practices? What are your injury and illness records for the past, usually 5 years? What are your training records? What are you doing to train your employees on safety and workplace violence? And then your workers' compensation injury records as well. OSHA also, if there is a complaint, could also conduct interviews with employees. And so, yes, there is a federal law that requires you to provide a safe workplace, and it's under the general duty clause of the OSHA Act. Connecticut also has a statute, 31-49, similar to the federal OSHA Act, that requires employers to provide employees with a reasonably safe place to work. This statute dates all the way back to 1902, and that's why you've got some of that clunky, outdated language. But similar to the OSHA Act, it does not provide a private cause of action. So again, an employee could not bring a claim directly under 31-49 to claim that an employer did not provide a reasonably safe place to work. However, employees have cited this statute, the public policy behind that statute, to bring claims of wrongful termination if the employee is terminated for refusing to work in unsafe working conditions. And so the leading case that established that cause of action is Parsons versus United Technologies Corporation. And in that case, this was a case that was ultimately decided by the Connecticut Supreme Court. The employee was terminated from their employment after they refused to accept an assignment to work in a war zone in a foreign country. Following their termination of employment, they brought a wrongful termination claim citing 31-249. And the Connecticut Supreme Court, also citing that statute and citing Connecticut's own Occupational Safety and Health Act, found that an employer can't state a wrongful discharge claim if they're terminated from their employment for refusing to work under conditions that pose substantial risk of death, disease, or serious physical harm, and that is not otherwise contemplated within the scope of their duty. So it's not something they otherwise are required to do as part of their job duty. So I think the takeaway for you is that there is a federal law, there is a Connecticut law that both require employers to provide a reasonably safe workplace. And then again, if an employee is terminated for refusing to perform certain work because it's unsafe to do so, they may be able to bring a wrongful termination claim. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about how the Workers' Compensation Act might factor into this discussion. You might be thinking, well, I have workers' comp insurance, so if an employee is injured due to an incident of workplace violence, wouldn't that be covered by the workers' compensation insurance that I have? And generally speaking, the answer is yes. Most workplace injuries, including injuries that arise from workplace violence, would be covered by workers' compensation, but ultimately it can depend on the specific circumstances, and I'll sort of walk through that a little bit. In Connecticut, in order for an injury to be compensable under the Workers' Compensation Act, it must arise out of and in the course of employment. That is a term of material art. And so if it does, then the employee's claim under the Workers' Compensation Act is the employee's exclusive remedy against the employer and his fellow employees for all personal injuries that arise out of and in the course of employment. So what does that mean? That means if an injury falls into the Workers' Compensation Act, the employee cannot sue the employer or a fellow employee over a work-related personal injury. There are only very few narrow exceptions to that rule, which I'll talk about. you should know that the Workers' Compensation Act was passed over 100 years ago, and there is a ton of litigation about what it means for an injury to arise out of and in the course of employment. There are many different scenarios in which employees can get injured. With respect to an injury that is due to an assault, the Workers' Comp Commission and courts have held that it will be considered to arise out of and in the course of employment if the employee is assaulted while defending their employer or their employer's property, or the assault was incidental to some employment duty. So let me give you an example. This is an old case from 1938. The case is called Stalginski versus Waterbury Rolling. And in that case, the Connecticut Supreme Court found that an injury that was caused by an assault was compensable, did arise out of the workers' compensation, did arise out of employment, and therefore fell under the Workers' Compensation Act. In that case, the assault occurred between two employees who had an argument about the conditions of employment. Both employees were working as casters helpers. They're working about 15 feet apart from each other, and one employee thought that the other employee was performing their work in a way that was sending smoke from their workstation to the other employee's workstation. So an argument ensued, and ultimately a fight broke out between the two employees. The employee who was injured attempted to bring a claim against the employer, and the court held that the claim fell under the Workers' Compensation Act because the fight arose out of the method in which the employment was customarily carried on in the plant, and that was approved by the employer. The fight was not due to just personal animosity between two employees. And so it emanated from a dispute about the conditions of employment. So it did fall under the Workers' Comp Act. Conversely, in another case, a different case, the Workers' Comp Commission did not find that an employee's injury arising out of an assault was compensable under the Workers' Comp Act. In that case, an employee was assaulted by a coworker who believed that the injured employee was telling others that they had a sexual relationship. And so that altercation, the Workers' Comp Commission found, had nothing to do with employment and nothing to do with defending the employer, defending the employer's property, and therefore the court held, or the Workers' Comp Commission held, that it did not fall under the Workers' Compensation Act. So let me try to button this up a little bit. So if a claim falls under the Workers' Compensation Act, that will be the employee's exclusive remedy. If a claim does not fall under the Workers' Compensation Act, that doesn't mean the employer is liable. In fact, in most cases, the employer is not liable in common law for claims that result from the assault of one of its employees by either another employee or a third party, unless it falls under this very narrow exception, to the Workers' Comp Exclusivity Act, which is on the slide. You can see that an employee may sue an employer for personal injuries when a plaintiff can establish that the employer either actually intended to injure the employee, so the employer actually intended to injure, or intentionally created a dangerous condition that made injury substantially certain to occur. So the first of that is quite narrow. The second is a little broader, but still a very narrow exception. So I'll give you a couple of cases where this exception, employee tried to bring claims under this exception to the Exclusivity Act. One case is from 2016 called Flick versus Bean. And in this case, the court held that the standard was not met. This exception was not, and therefore the court dismissed an employee's common law claim against his employer. In this case, the employee plaintiff was working at a gas station when he saw somebody urinating on the side of the building. He went outside and he confronted that third party and ultimately was assaulted and badly injured. He brought a common law claim against his employer to recover damages for his injuries. And the court dismissed the common law claim because the employee could not allege any facts showing that the employer knew or believed that working on the late shift would result in injury to the employee. And so that doesn't mean the employee doesn't have a claim. He has a workers' compensation claim, but he was not able to assert a common law claim against his employer. There is another case involving two employees who were working at the Cheesecake Factory. One employee spilled some liquid on a soda machine. The floor supervisor got angry, started berating that employee, and then eventually attacked and injured her. The employee tried to bring a common law negligence claim against the employer, claiming that the employer failed to protect the safety and well-being of its employees. And the court struck that claim on the grounds that it was barred by the exclusivity provision of the Workers' Comp Act. So the bottom line is that most workplace injuries that employees suffer will fall under the Workers' Compensation Act. And Typically, the employer will not be directly liable in common law, but there are situations, there is an exception to that workers' comp act where claims could be brought directly against the employer. I want to talk a little bit now about employer liability to third parties when their employees misbehave, in essence. So employers can be liable to third parties, whether it's a vendor, a customer, somebody in the public, for injuries that they sustain as a result of violent acts that are committed by the employer's employees. Typically, these claims are brought against a company or an employer under a common law claim of negligent supervision or negligent hiring, negligent retention. The elements are very similar, but typically it's a negligent supervision claim. In order to prove that, the plaintiff must show that they suffered an injury due to the defendant's own negligence, so the employer's own negligence in not supervising its employees, in failing to properly supervise an employer agent who the defendant had a duty to supervise and the defendant knew or should have known would cause that injury. So that is the standard. Those are the elements that a plaintiff, a third party, must prove in order to state a negligent supervision claim against an employer. There are two cases that I want to just mention because I think they highlight how you can get different results based on facts that are sometimes difficult to reconcile. So the first case is Bourbon versus Hill Health Corporation. And in that case, the court denied the employer's motion for summary judgment. And in the second case, Pruitt versus Main and Tower, the court entered judgment in favor of the employer. So Bourbon, the employer lost. Pruitt, the employer won. And so just a little bit of the facts in the Bourbon case. This case involved the rape of a patient at a mental health facility by an employee security guard. The rape resulted in an unwanted pregnancy and other emotional and psychological injuries to the patient. The employer had done a background check before hiring the security guard, and there was no criminal history and no criminal charges in that security guard's background report. His job references were excellent, and during the period of employment, he was considered an exemplary employee right up to the time of the attack. There hadn't been any prior incidents involving patients and guards having sexual relations at the facilities, and no prior incidents involving this particular security guard. The assault took place in a stairwell, okay? So the court looked at these factors and concluded that it was still a question of fact as to whether or not that sexual assault was foreseeable. So basically what the court said is questions of fact are really to be decided by a jury, and therefore the court denied the employer's motion for summary judgment on a negligent supervision claim, saying, look, that's got to go to the jury. Here are some of the things that the court did look at in denying that motion for summary judgment. The court pointed to expert testimony, which said that the facility did not have an adequate security staffing or an adequate security plan. The court noted that there were no other security guards on duty on the floor, and the security guard at his deposition, the security guard who committed the assault, when he was asked, he testified that if another security guard had been present, the assault would not have happened because he would have been caught. The security supervisor knew that there was an increased risk of injury in the stairwell. There were no security cameras in the stairwell. The plaintiff was in a vulnerable and weak population, which the court said required greater protection on behalf of the employer. And the plaintiff was required to be under the supervision, the patient was required to be under the supervision or the protection and care of male employees while only wearing hospital scrubs with no undergarments. And so the court looked at these factors and said, well, maybe a jury could conclude that the Hill Health Corporation was negligent in not failing to provide a safe environment for the patient. So it denied the motion for summary judgment. This other case, Pruitt versus Main and Tower, as I said, the court in this case held that the owner of a bar or the employer was not liable for negligent supervision of a bouncer employee who ended up shooting a patron, somebody who was trying to enter the bar or the cafe. In this case, when the patron tried to enter the bar to get his cell phone or to order food, it wasn't really clear. He was ultimately assaulted by the bouncer to the point where he became unconscious, at least momentarily unconscious. And so after he regained consciousness, he tried to come back into the bar and about 30 minutes later, and the bouncer ended up shooting him in the stomach. So an altercation occurred again. The bouncer got a gun that was being held where the disc jockey's kind of work area was, took that gun and ended up shooting the patron in the stomach. And the court found that in this case, the bouncer's acts toward the plaintiffs were personal, that he acted well outside the scope of his employment, and therefore the court found that the employer bar was not liable for the bouncer's actions. There was no evidence that the employer knew that the gun was stored in the cabinet of the disc jockey, where the disc jockey worked. And the court reasoned that the owner of that bar had no knowledge that the employee would act in the manner that he did, and that the employee was really just acting totally outside the scope of any employment as a bouncer. So, the cases, you could quibble with all the cases. There are a lot of cases involving these. They're very fact specific, and sometimes it may be difficult to reconcile some of the facts. And I just think that's important for you to understand from a legal standpoint. Some of the things I just wanted to cover, some best practices really from a legal perspective. And as I mentioned, Mike will go into much more greater detail about some practical steps you can take. But I really think it's important for employers to conduct some form of background check on all of its employees. I know it's just a snapshot in time. It just tells you what that person's background is at that particular moment when you're conducting the hiring. But it can certainly disclose to the employer a criminal history or a background that is one that the employer may consider not going forward and hiring a particular employee. I think it is a best practice. If you do hire a third party to conduct the background check, you do need to do that in compliance with this federal law, this Federal Credit Reporting Act, and ban the box laws. The other thing you need to do, and this is tough, you've got to balance your concerns about workplace safety and violence with the EEOC's caution about being overly zealous in denying employment to individuals with criminal histories. The EEOC takes the position that each situation should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and that if an employer is too aggressive in denying employment to employees with a criminal history, that could have a discriminatory impact. So the EEOC cautions employers not to be overzealous in denying employment to individuals with a criminal history. You ought to consider a workplace search policy that simply advises employees that certain things in the workplace are subject to search, whether it's their desk, their file cabinets, even their personal belongings, although I'd be very careful about doing a search of personal belongings. I would try to limit practices that put employees at risk of an assault. For example, having employees work late or work late alone in a particular area. Certainly take extra precautions if you're terminating a potentially volatile employee. We get this quite a bit. Think about hiring a security firm. Think about alerting the local police. They may not do much other than just sort of be in the area. Think about doing it remotely, although that's not the ideal way to tell an employee that their employment is being terminated. If there's a safety concern, it's acceptable. And I think doing it by video has made that more common. The other thing that's really critical is to develop a policy, a workplace violence policy. Every employer really should have one in their employee handbook. And when you talk about workplace violence, I know we're talking about physical assaults, but really it's more than that. It's more than physical assaults. In fact, in many cases, it's not a physical assault that's an incident of violence. It's also threatening behavior, it's verbal abuse, it's certain non-physical violent acts such as harassment or bullying or intimidation. And so in your policy, it should define workplace violence somewhat broadly to cover all those different types of aggressive, violent behavior. Obviously, indicate the company's stance on violence. Zero tolerance, we will not tolerate. They're prohibited, make that clear. Identify the workplace, any location where any work is performed, including any surrounding areas that the employer controls, like the parking lot or any remote work. So that also should be covered in the policy. Identify the scope of the policy. Make it clear that it applies not just to employees, but also to customers, clients, vendors, contractors, visitors, really anyone who enters the workplace or who interacts with your employees. And this is critical. Make sure your policy has a clear process for reporting incidents of workplace violence. This is really critical. It's just as important to have a process that's clear here as it is in your anti-harassment policy. It should encourage employees to promptly report any incidents of workplace violence, whether they're the subject of it or whether they witness it. There should be at least two management employees that can be contacted by the employee. So if one is not available, another one is, or if one is not, if one employee is not comfortable reporting to a particular management employee, they have another option. You want that language that says employees who make reports of incidents of workplace violence will not be retaliated against by the company. And then obviously you need to investigate promptly all incidents of workplace violence, just as you would a claim of discrimination or harassment in the workplace. Some other thoughts too, you should ban or consider banning all weapons of any kind, not just guns, anything, any kind of weapon in the workplace, in the work areas or on the premises, the employer's premises. There are some state laws, Connecticut is not one of them, but there are some state laws that may allow employees to keep weapons in their locked vehicles in the parking lot. And so if you are an employer who conducts business outside of Connecticut, you need to be aware of other state laws that may apply. Think about whether or not you want to permit employees to be able to come to the office or come to the workplace when they're not scheduled to work, so off hours. In some cases, it makes sense that an employee is able to do that. In some cases, it doesn't make any sense. They don't really have a business reason to be there. Perhaps they're unsupervised. And so that too can be a way to mitigate risk. Provide an employee assistance program that can help employees in a confidential manner who are going through any kind of personal hardship. It can be very helpful if you have an employee who is showing, any kind of anger issues at work, to be able to have a conversation with that employee, advise them that EAP services are available, and in some cases make a mandatory referral to EAP, that employee is required to reach out to EAP on a confidential basis and go through and have a conversation. So I think you ought to consider that. And it's a way to also show that you're supporting employee mental health. I think an increasing number of employers have EAP programs available. And then train employees on the policy, make sure they understand what that policy says and what their role is. If they do either observe or it's reported to them that there's an incident of workplace violence, have a conversation about when it's appropriate to call law enforcement directly. There's an immediate threat or a significant threat that really needs to be handled by law enforcement and not necessarily by the employer. And so the last thing I wanted to mention, and I'm just not really gonna speak to each one of these, but there are some possible red flags when you may have an employee. I think Mike will get into this a little bit more, but when you may have an employee that might be exhibiting behaviors that suggest the possibility of an incident of safety or violence in the workplace. The only thing I'll say, and these are fairly well recognized sort of red flags, but you do need to be careful here about making snap judgments. You need to be careful about not giving the appearance that you think somebody has a mental health issue or somehow mentally unstable. Need to be careful about drawing conclusions here. Certainly be alert. Make sure your management team is alert to these sort of warning signs, but not necessarily act in and of themselves. Take into consideration all the facts and circumstances. And so that's all I have from a legal perspective. If there are any kind of questions, I can go through them now. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Mike to start his portion.
Okay.
Thanks, Nick. There is one question that came in for you. And if there are any other questions, go ahead and submit those in the Q&A panel. So Nick, this is the question. Have an employee that got arrested yesterday for criminal possession of a pistol. I am not taking action until we know if he is getting charged or not, etc. What's an employee's best practice for handling? And what are our liabilities, if any?
Yeah, great question. So I typically do not advise an employer to take an action based on a charge in and of itself, unless that charge is quite serious, in which case maybe there's a suspension perhaps with pay. But I think given that the nature of that criminal possession of a pistol, that could just very well be somebody who has not registered that particular pistol. I don't know that necessarily warrants an employment action, other than maybe you having that employee bring to your attention the outcome, especially if it's something that's you become aware of through the newspaper and other employees are aware of as well, and they brought it to your attention. So you do need to be careful, obviously vigilant about protecting employees and vigilant about safety and gun violence in the workplace. But I don't want you to take, overreact either and take disciplinary action or employment action just based on a charge in and of itself, unless the circumstances warrant reasons for doing so. So, and yes, the slides will be, my slides will be available after the meeting.
Oh, great. Thanks for asking that. There is one more question for you, Nick, that came in through the chat. There's a scenario example. Male employee is harassing a female employee outside of work. May the employer discipline the male employee, and how to handle this at work?
Yes, so invariably when you have harassment that happens outside of the workplace between coworkers, it usually trickles back in some way. Like, it's very difficult, it seems, that two employees who may be working together and there's something happening outside of work and that not to have any effect in the workplace. And so I think invariably in that situation, the employer is going to have to at least ask some questions, not necessarily draw any conclusions about what happened outside of the workplace, but it would seem to me that the employer would be well advised to at least be alert and perhaps investigate, just depending on what's being reported to that employer, investigate that off-duty incident, because it very well will likely trickle into the workplace.
Great. That looks like all the questions for now, Nick. If you have any further questions, feel free to submit those into the Q&A panel, and we'll have Mike go ahead and take over for the next portion.
Okay. Thanks again, Nick. Our second speaker is Mike Miele of Safety, Security, Emergency Preparedness and Response. Mike has been working as a health and safety manager for over 30 years in various companies, including Sikorsky Aircraft and Hamilton Sunstrom. He's also worked as the Safety and Health Director at Eaton Corporation and currently works as Regional Environmental Health and Safety Director for Danfoss Power Solutions. Mike has an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering from Waterbury State Technical College and graduate degrees in management and homeland security leadership from RPI and UConn, respectively. Please join me in welcoming Mike Miele.
Thanks, Phil. Appreciate that. Nick, thank you. Nice job. And so, some of the stuff that Nick talked about, yeah, I'm going to reinforce a couple of those points. But before I go forward, first question for everybody on this call. If you were confronted right now by an active shooter in your place of employment where you're sitting, what would you be doing? What's your response to that? Have you had any planning around that? And if you've had planning, have you been practicing that planning? So I just want you to think about that as we go forward through the material that I prepared. We'll come back to it later on, but this is the kind of stuff that I'm going to focus on workplace violence as Nick did, but more of what I'm going to talk about is really the active shooter and some of the things that you can do as an employer and even in your personal lives, right, to protect yourselves or to prepare for the potential that's taking place. So a lot of the focus, like I said, is going to be on it's really around more on detection and response to the issue, and really increasing your chances for survivability, right? And you'll understand what I mean when I talk about that as we go forward. 3 learning objectives, real quick. One is to just get you to think differently. With everything that's been going on around this gun violence stuff, I mean, I'm sure you already are. But we're going to try and focus on thinking differently, preparation, right? Everything we do in life, if we prepare and we do a good job of preparation, hopefully the outcome is good. And that applies in everything, right? Sports, school, personal lives. And the last one, just, I want you to take away, hopefully you're going to take away some specific things you can do right now that do not cost significant amount of money, because I realize that a lot of folks on this call, maybe bigger companies, some are smaller, budgets are always a concern, but what you really can do practically right now. Okay, so from there, when I threw this chart, and this really kind of hits home, right? This is, again, you made such a tragic situation. The kids, right? I mean, this is really what our children are their future, our grandchildren's. I have a 1.5-year-old grandchild right now, and so these poor kids having to feel so much fear before they go to school, or in this case, to have to respond. So there's a piece of this that does really get to the heart. Some of the data, and there's a ton of it, right? I'm sure some of you guys may be searching. You can go into the internet and find a bunch, but this was from the Washington Post. And you can see, right, 186 days into the year. This was up to July 4th, 314 mass shootings. And so, what I kind of earmarked on the takeaway in this slide, not a single week in 2022 passed without at least 4 mass shootings. And if you guys know what a scatter plot chart is, this is kind of an interesting way to look at a scatter plot chart. These are the dots in each of the days of each month represent an actual mass shooting for the months of January, February, March, April, May of this year, June. I mean, it's just, this is just the trajectory just feels like it's spiraling out of control as it relates to this thing. Even July, right? 4th of July, there's almost 8 events on that one day. So really a lot going on. And this is just, again, not just around the workplace, but in our personal lives, right? Where we go just to do routine things that we're normally used to without having so much concern. And then I happened to just grab this. This was I probably could have taken a snapshot of CNN every day before while I was preparing this thing, but this was the weekend of the 26th of August, 5 dead, 13 separate shootings in New York City from Friday to Sunday, right? So I thought, this chart, I'd like to just sort of reflect on it, right? It's personal, in your personal life, your workplace, we don't need to live in fear, right? The whole concept of what I want to drive today is it's about being prepared, right? I sent an internet story to my older daughter's boyfriend, and it was about a person that used to be a criminal, and he shared 31 things that he did as a criminal that provided some level of insight. So I sent it to him. He sends me a note back and says, well, thanks for scaring the crap out of me. I said, no, Justin, the point is understanding what they're thinking. It helps you better prepare for the potential that happening. But both of these are choices, right? And so this is where I want to just kind of have you think about what you choose to do about getting prepared for the potential for an active shooter in your workplace, or if you confront somebody, in the street, how to respond to that. The block at the bottom is in Latin. It just says, it's just always ready. I also just wanted to point to this. I thought was a great book. I got part of the Homeland Security program I was in. This was written by, Bruce. I'm not going to pronounce his last name properly. He's the author, but a lot of really good stuff in there. And the takeaway from this is that all security involves trade-offs. So, what I mean by that is really, if you think about these types of activities that you do in your normal life, flying, right? So flying has potential for having the risk of a significant event, whether the plane, it crashes, if you're afraid to get on because of somebody that might be, planting the classic bomb. Your trade-off could be you just don't fly, or you're going to drive. Driving, again, when I think about the driving piece, when we drive on the roads, this is everywhere in the US and even globally, right? The only thing that stands between you and the person on the other side of that road is a double yellow line, right? You're trusting that person's going to not cross that yellow line. So, but if you don't feel comfortable, if you're concerned about that being an issue, maybe you don't drive at night because alcohol is more prevalent in people driving after a certain hour. And so you decide not to go out at that point in time. Or maybe you don't drive at all and you just, turn to a bike. But again, trade-offs, right? Going to restaurants. I mean, I go into a restaurant, I hate to say it, but I normally try to find a chair that's near an exit, and typically want to face what's coming in for folks that are actually going to enter that restaurant, right? Public events we've seen going on, shopping, going to school, obviously has been a huge issue for our kids, churches. And of course, the reason we're having a large conversation here is your job in the private and public sector, right? This was a chart I thought was interesting. I went and took a training class for competent training for for fall protection. And so the thing that I just wanted to share, it just jumped out at me, right, is that red bar. The trend line looks maybe a little bit encouraging, but over that period of time, right, going from almost 900 fatalities and workplace fatalities that are related to workplace violence, right, we're down to about 518, but still way too much. But the point I wanted to make here is this is nothing new, right? It goes back to 1986 when the phrase that going postal became, sort of a household statement around mass shootings and workplace violence and gun violence in the workplace. So it's nothing new. And so hopefully people have been doing things to try to anticipate and prevent, but there's just way too much of it still going on. So now I'm at my agenda, but this is really what I want to focus in on. We're going to start with a little bit on vulnerability assessments. How do you prioritize risks and then decide on what you're going to invest for controls? And a simple approach that I'd like to share, the run, hide, fight response, which is still universal. ALICE training, which is something that's out there for school systems. I haven't spent a lot of time in that, but I'm planning to try to get certified in that particular training, but a little bit of difference there. I want to spend a lot of time on building exits, and you'll see why. I think that's important. Infrastructure hardening, we're going to talk about some of the things that you probably already have in place, but some other things maybe you haven't thought about in terms of hardening your facility or your property and your grounds. And I could talk forever on what to do at home, but I'm not going to spend a ton there. Knowing demographics, knowing your local area when you're looking at a facility, and I'll give you a couple of examples why that's important to know, what the neighborhood's like, what kind of the crime rates are. Is there a lot of drug deals going on? So we'll get into a little bit of that. The couple things around the workplace violence program elements. I want to spend a little time on soft stuff, technology options that are out there. And I think crisis communication becomes important in just a summary. So the takeaway from this chart, right? Business continuity sort of flow chart. The top part really is the event takes place, whatever that thing is. Average time of an incident is roughly 5 minutes when we're talking about an active shooter. Average time for police response is 15. So there's a time, the window of time that you need to be prepared, right? Or have your employees understand how to be prepared, how to react and what to do and where to go. Evacuation for fire is a whole lot different for evacuation from an active shooter. We'll talk about that. On the vulnerability assessment discussion, so first place is think about assembling a workplace violence team, or you integrate the topic into maybe an existing group that you have. It could be your staff meeting. It could be you have a safety team. You could have any kind of standard team, but start to bring the topic in at a reasonable rate, right? The hard part for this is not making employees become afraid. And so, but this has to be discussed, and you have to pick the right people to be part of that discussion. Stakeholders, I say those at the ground level are critical, right? So to me, for the time I've spent in manufacturing, I've had, large facilities. If you guys are familiar with Sikorsky, 2.2 million square feet, 8,000 employees at one point, about 5,000 working on helicopters. So it's a lot of opportunity for people to get mad at each other. And I got stories I could tell you for hours, but the point is, those folks are the ones that know what's going on the ground level. So if there's potential issues, you kind of want to have their trust, and you want to have dialogue, and you want to have them be willing to, as Nick already talked about, right? You want a process for them to report issues. It's absolutely critical. I'm going to talk a little about consulting with local law enforcement, Homeland Security, Connecticut. I spoke with the director of that actually yesterday. So there's some things that they can offer for support. And then you will get access to an existing assessment tool, again, available on the internet, but I thought it's a pretty good tool. So if you want to use it for guidance as it relates to doing your own assessment, then it's a great tool to start with. And the other piece is having a periodic review process. This is not something that's one and done. Right, we talk about doing workplace violence, active shooter, tabletop drills, And so at one point, the employer that I was with wanted to do it once every 3 years. It's like, well, personally, I didn't think that that was frequent enough, but the point I'm making is, as you do your assessments and determine where your vulnerabilities are, you want to make sure that those are under some level of control. You got to come back and verify that you haven't had any deviation from those controls and whether they're effective. All right, this is probably the only line in red that I've bolded in my slides, right? Just like I said, like it says, just get over the idea that it can't happen here. How many times have we seen the media, on the output of an issue, and typically the response from somebody in the neighborhood or the plant site say, I just can't believe it happened here. Just think about it as the potential is, it's not a matter of, if, it's a matter of when. Partnering with local law enforcement, phone call to the police, right? Who would be the people that would respond in the event of having, serious workplace violence incident or an active shooter that shows up at your facility, or on the grounds where your folks are working, or in your distribution center from, maybe a truck driver. Have them come to the facility, and wherever you want them to sort of look at what they would be, right, toward the inside and the outside of the facility and the grounds. And you got to review the exits. How would they get in a hurry? So, we do a lot of things around access. I'm going to talk about access control, right? So if you have a facility and all doors have, let's say, electronic car key access, no way anybody's getting in unless you got one. If the police show up to address an active shooter and they can't get in, especially if you got a large facility, then that's going to take them obviously a ton of time off of their response capability. So, I've got it down here, right? Do you provide access to them with badge entry, in advance? Do you have a lockbox for them to be able to get access? Have them come in and look at the facility, test radio communication. I had a site in Van Wert, Ohio, where they came in and they toured, and because of the construction of the building, their radios wouldn't work. So they were able to make that determination. So a lot of these little things, right? We talk about when this stuff unfolds, the chaos, confusion is instantaneous. So these things that you can do to make sure you're prepared and that you have a good level of education to your workforce and to your management staff is going to increase that survivability, right? And the ability to escape. I already talked about understanding local demographics, access control. I mean, I put the note there for myself. At a site in Glendale, Pennsylvania, security guard they had in the facility because they felt they needed it based on where the plant was. It was sort of in a downtown area, doors locked, right across the street. Bad drug deal goes on, guy gets shot, he comes flying across the street, he's bleeding, banging on the door to try to get into the plant, right? Gunman standing there right behind him. So, I mean, ultimately, it was resolved and nobody was killed, but they knew enough to know that the area they were in, they had to have secure doors for that facility. Williamsburg, Virginia, manufacturing facility out in a beautiful industrial complex. Loading docks, right, wide open, stairway into the building by the loading docks, wide open. Several people come wandering in one day. The people shipping and receiving, like, who are these people? Thank God they were just there trying to sell things. But again, free access to the building, no control. And then I had one more that I had a facility in only in New York. This was, again, I think Nick kind of started leaning on this one. Employee was terminated externally, showed up at the plant at night. There was no control in terms of, there was no communication to any of the employees about that. The guy shows up, knocks on the door and gets another employee to let him in. He confronts his supervisor in the plant. So again, nothing came of it that was terrible in terms of shooting a gun. But again, this is how the employee got access. So, do you start thinking about installing turnstiles, right? We always have the concern around people tailgating on the entrances to facilities. So just a lot to think about. I just mentioned the loading docks, just in terms of examples of things that we've installed, or at least some of the plants I had installed for loading docks, metal mesh, right? Why do the loading docks stay open? routinely, especially during the summer, because it's hot. Same with the doors. I mean, I had multiple plants where the doors around the perimeter of the facility, like the photograph in the middle, they're open, especially at night, because they want it, the employees are hot, there's no air conditioning, so they want to get cooled off. These doors are, I mean, I was at a site in Jackson, Michigan. We were doing actually a safety audit. It was like a week-long audit. And so what I typically do is come back at night to look at the lighting of the facility, how well is it lit from a security standpoint and access control, right? When I drive in the parking lot, the door's wide open. So nothing happens, that's great. But if you have somebody that just wants to wander in, so here's some options to think about that you can install on your doors. And if these things in the middle are on there, you have to be aware if you have an evacuation because of fire or some other means, that you have to be able to get that open pretty quickly. All right. So, Division of Emergency Management, Homeland Security in Connecticut. This is right off of their website. You can sort of read the detail. But this is the Critical Infrastructure Protection Unit. And you can see that they have a charter here and offer the following services capabilities. Right. So there's one caveat, which I'll get to, but vulnerability assessments, security assessments, mitigation, prevention strategies, all the stuff that's here. School system walkthroughs, and they actually have some training programs that look to be very helpful. The only issue is this is focused on what they define as critical infrastructure sectors. And those are links on their website that you can go to see if you happen to fit, your business fits into that. So I said, let me email the number. Email the email address here and see what I can get for response. I tested the system out. So I did that twice, no response. I called the phone number, it's there. And on 2 occasions, I got the state police department because it was after hours. So finally, long story short, I got a hold of the director I mentioned earlier. I spoke to him yesterday. He said, yeah, no, we do provide the services. This was sort of the quote that they gave me. He told me that the gentleman to contact, if any of you want to see if they can be helpful on the stuff I showed you, is Sergeant First Class John Wardrop. He yesterday told me he would let him know that he may be getting contacted because the person that he's got now apparently is leaving the business. But anyways, it's potential service that's probably at no cost if you want to take advantage of their expertise. All right, so the risk assessment process, this was I thought, it's an article in Health and Safety magazine that was discussing why employees do things unsafely. So we're a safety mentality here. So the 3 bullets, I thought it framed it pretty good. I mean, things you probably already know, so I don't mean to insult anybody's intelligence. But besides being rushed, because there's somebody there that they need to meet the production metrics or get the product out the door. But the first was lack of being able to recognize the hazard. So you may we don't know. So again, try to relate this to the issues related to workplace violence risk factors. You know what I mean? When you think about it, I'll talk about a little bit more around that. Normalization of risk. How many times we walk by things that are a problem and we don't do anything because we just don't see it as an issue, right? It's just normalized deviance. And here's the classic one. At the end of this meeting, this afternoon or tomorrow or next week, I challenge you guys, wherever you work, offices included, even though offices are probably in better shape, go look at your emergency exits. I want you to just go look at them, go see if the doors function properly. Do they have crash bars? Are there exit signs above the door identifying that they're emergency exits? Where do they go when somebody goes out the building? And we'll talk about, the whole concept. If you have an active shooter and you need people to go to continue to move, right? Because it's about escaping and surviving. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. And even walking working surfaces, right? You walk in the building, sidewalks, floors have bumps, concrete, sidewalks, bad. You just keep walking over them. Just normalize deviance. Somebody trips, falls, breaks their arm, especially today because usually they're walking if they're facing their cell phone or not watching anyway. But, we've had a fall doing the same thing and break arms. And so I'm just trying to make a point about normalized deviance. And then the illusion of invulnerability, right? It won't happen here. It's not going to happen to me. So same holds true for workplace violence when we talk about some of the physical attributes that you have to pay attention to. Quantifying the vulnerability using a risk assessment process. I just wanted to share, here's a simple tool, right? The risk cube is pretty universal. Finance world uses it. Safety world uses it. 25 years with UTC, if anybody's on from UTC, they know what I'm talking about, right? But you're gonna take a look at what are those physical attributes that you need to consider. You sort of evaluate the severity of an incident if it takes place. And then, of course, the probability and likelihood. So in a lot of so here's just a quick methodology. You just take these three components, these three attributes, measure them 1 to 5, 5 being the highest, and then your control measure you apply based on what you have for control, if any at all, and you come up with your resultant risk ranking. Here's just a fictitious result of all that. You may say access control, we're good, right? Nobody can get in the building without card key access. Perimeter fencing, right? Think about your facility. And again, when I talk about demographics, should you have perimeter fencing to make sure, you've got some level of security for people that would wander into your plant or your factory or your office. And again, I understand, if you're running a business like, I think there was one of the car wash businesses signed up for this. Unless you feel that you have to put something like that, but fencing becomes an important piece of your infrastructure hardening. Background checks, Nick talked a lot about that. Vehicle access to your facility. Loading dock access I talked about. Adequacy of exits, we're going to talk about that in a minute. And then visitor control, right? So when people come in to the building, do you have some level of prevention? They just can't walk right in. Loading docks. So when you think about your loading docks, again, distribution center may be a different story, but when truck drivers show up at your plant, what's the first thing that they do? They want to go to the bathroom. And so what do? If you have no control, they just wander in. I can't tell you how many times we've had, who's this guy walking through the plant? Oh yeah, he's a truck driver just looking to use the bathroom. But even when COVID came around, it became even more concerning, right? We don't know if the guy's symptomatic. So that became a whole other. But from the control perspective, we require I'll call it a holding pen, right? So when they come to the facility, they have a place to go, but they can't walk in unless they're escorted by somebody, right? And they're evaluated for what they want to be doing. Vehicle access, again, just depends on what you want for control around having vehicles not being able to go where they're not supposed to go. And then you start getting some real sophisticated stuff. I can tell you, at the Sikorsky plant, being obviously a defense contractor, and after 9/11, we spent a lot of time on anticipating terrorist activity, tabletop drills, vehicle access, somebody driving in with the guy that was the Times Square bomber. The story I was told, he had Sikorsky on his list. So, right, those are the things that they needed to focus on in concerns for those types of things, very significant. But in the blue box at the bottom, and Nick was good to remind me about this at this point, everything that you evaluate and you make decisions on, you have, quantified, qualified, document your decision making. So you have good records. Because if you evaluate something as being, let's say, a medium concern, you say, don't have the funding, can't do it now. Make sure you guys have the rationale documented. So if it ever comes up, right, you thought that stuff through. All right. Let me talk about building exits. There's a lot on the charts. Just bear with me. The photograph upper right. So design, capacity, and numbers. Just an illustration of a facility that had a second level, and the stairwell there was just determined to be not a good place for folks to be exiting if there was an issue because it discharged into the lobby. They identified where their high risk areas are. And so the ones in the middle were that of a theater. If you can see that they had only 2 exits that were listed they're up at the front, and they ultimately added 2, 4, 6, 8 additional exits to increase the capability of people to exit from that particular facility. So capacity of exits, where are they located? And again, the life safety code requires you got to have enough exits to handle the capacity of your folks in the plant. Certain dimensions based on numbers of people, all kinds of detail, but just for workplace violence, active shooter mentality, right? How many people you have, where they're located, can they get to an exit, and then where does that exit discharge to? So the routes, signage, right? Clarity of direction. So is there enough clarity of what that exit is, where it's going to go? Sometimes you might be able to add some additional language there. Is it in English? Does it need to be in other languages? So if you have, workforce they don't speak English, but if you're trying to direct them, something like that may be a little bit helpful to do for people that don't speak English. Stairwells, access control going up. The photograph on the bottom right-hand side, you can see it's sort of a metal door assembly. My son-in-law does fire inspections for his business, and he was just telling me that, he was in a school system that they had those kinds of doors on stairwells going up. So if you think about it, and this is not Mike Miele's idea, this is great information from the link at the bottom of this chart, and it'll be in your handout. Really good stuff from this particular consultant on exits. I encourage you to read it. But he talked about in some of the events where you basically, shelter in place, but you go up, right? Don't come down and shoot. I mean, I don't think any case I've ever heard of an active shooter that comes in, on a second or third floor, or comes in from the roof, right? They're going to come in somehow at the ground level. So if you have a second level in the building, if you think about a lot of school systems that kids go up and then have these stairwells controlled. Remember the time frame, right? 5 minutes typical for the event, 15 for response on average. So if they go up and they're secure, you have that time frame for the police to respond. And instead of these kids discharging, or you're having your employees discharge out into an area where now they're still a target. So it was an interesting concept, but something to think about when you look at your facility. Doors, mag control doors. Just the point that he made was somebody looming outside your plant, your facility, your office, where you have electromagnetic control. They can sit there and if they're lurking, sometimes what happens is people walk by in that particular area and it trips it. So that person's waiting for that click noise, and then all of a sudden they're in the building. So just again, some of these little subtle, nuances to think about. Unconventional options, there was a couple cases where people were able to escape through ventilation ductwork. I mean, when you look at, I know probably getting a little crazy here, but things that you want to identify as options if it really came down to it. And then we'll talk a little more on safe rooms. I got a couple great resources in the handout and again, these are not things that are, some of them are not that expensive to do, but the design ideas are great. Some of them were expensive, and there's two references there. One for active shooter, and then the other one is based on the protection for tornadoes. It's a FEMA document, so it's a good reference. Delayed egress I'll talk about, and then I already talked about roofs as a safe zone, maybe, right? So be aware, delayed, and this guy speaks to the same stuff. Delayed egress. Primary reasons for delayed egress. You probably have seen these, right? There are doors that once you hit the crash bar, alarm goes off, but then it's not open for 15 seconds, in some cases 30 seconds. He has a link in the website that I sent you that he basically runs a 30-second timer, and in the background is a guy shooting a gun. And if you sit there and count how many times the gun goes off, it's scary. So you're sitting there to say, Mike, well, what the hell? What am I supposed to do? Well, let me get to that in a second, right? I just want to make sure the reasons they're there, and you probably all know, right? Maybe some of you guys have stores, restaurants, right? The people that work in restaurants steal food. They don't want if they try to go out the back door, they want the ability to respond before they get out. Stores, same thing. Costco's, I go to the one that I'm close to in Waterbury, right? They're right there in the door. If you're in the airport, they don't want passengers going out of terminals or runways. Elderly facilities, same thing. Patients, they don't want people that are unauthorized to leave. So they're there, and it's a conflicting issue when you talk about an active shooter. just remember too that they're supposed to be tied to the fire suppression system. So if the fire alarm goes off or the fire suppression goes off, that door automatically opens. So, but all I'm saying to you is if you see the door, if you're in a situation, you got to just keep moving, right? You're not going to see, you don't hit the door and stand and wait and hope you don't get shot if that's what's going on. You got to just keep moving. And that's a piece of what I'm going to talk about on the run, hide, fight approach. Okay. All right. So in the chat, this is the only question I need you to put in the chat. And Laura, maybe you can help me just identify, right? Does anybody give me a shout out or in the chat? What do you think that silver pole is on the side of this building? See if anybody's awake.
There we go. We've got someone, fire pole.
Okay. Come on.
See if there's any
Anybody else? What do you think that thing is?
a two-scape, communicating with Mars, a camera,
A camera.
a flagpole.
Flagpole. This, so yeah, as they come in, just shout them out. So this facility I had responsibility for in Middlesex, North Carolina. I walked in this building, I don't know how many times over several years, I always saw this thing and never gave it a second look. So one day I come in and then I look and see, okay, so it's an escape ladder that folds out. And the only way you can open it is from the top. So I'm sharing it as if you think about the idea of evacuating up to a roof, if this is an option for installation, you would have to get approval from your local fire marshal, again, authority having jurisdiction. I think in this case, that facility, the fire department wanted it there in case they were up on the roof for a fire. Again, sort of a obscure thought, but it's still, it's something to think about. If you have people evacuate up to the roof, maybe there's a safe room that you end up having up there. That's something that can be configured out of maybe some of the HVAC systems, or you build one up so it's there. But again, just an idea on how to get off the roof if it's safe to do so. Emergency exits. This one was a facility in North Carolina as well. About 2 weeks before these guys got cited for the emergency exit being blocked. And it was about 2 weeks before that happened. I was sending a communication on this topic to make sure you guys have these exits all are being checked routinely. So fire marshal happened to show up. He went and checked all the exits and sure enough couldn't open the door. And this is what they found. So as rare as it is, these kinds of things can happen, especially in the wintertime. If you got a facility, classic issue is doors are blocked by snow. And if it's hard snow, you got to get out, you got to make sure those things are clear. So these are all little details that come into play, just for not just for normal life safety code issues, but if people got to get out in a hurry, right? All right, so again, Nick talked a lot about some of these things. I'm just going to run through these a little bit more, but types of threats on the workplace violence piece. We have people that there's a lot of stuff going on with people just in general, right? And so the volatility of human behavior is a constant concern, especially when they're in a work environment that's maybe wicked hot. I know Nick talked about some examples of people, the guy next to each other having them, present unsafe or unhealthy conditions and got upset about it. But you got different threats: indirect, conditional, and direct. Right? Indirect, it's the classic. I'm not directing it to somebody, but it's a secondary piece where if that person continues to do what they're doing. Conditional is going to be, if you do this, this is what's going to happen, and then it's obviously direct confrontation. And then the risk factors and latent drivers. Again, Nick had talked about these already. But again, these are all things that you want your supervisors, unfortunately, to be cognizant of for their people that work for them. It's a lot on the frontline supervisor, not only the pressure that they have, and again, I'm being sensitive to it. Not everybody on the call is a manufacturing facility, but if you're a business owner, you got people that work for you. And so these are things that become drivers. And of course, these additional risk factors, again, these were also, I think Nick pointed at these as well, but, between mood shifts, all kinds of traumatic, incidents in people's lives that can drive the behaviors. That's why I was stressing having that workplace violence prevention team if you can get a cross section of your folks that are in the trench, so to speak, like I said, that trust what you're trying to do to be helpful, you're gonna get, they'll give you the information. We had just another example. My wife is a nurse, if you guys have ever heard of the nurse navigators that are out there in different programs, she was doing for cardiac. So, while I was at Sikorsky, I said, you know what, we're gonna create an EHS safety navigator program. And so we tried to model that, but for every single incident that took place in the factory, whether it was, first aid case, a near miss, anything that we thought needed to be responded to, we had a group of people that went out and got on the floor and talked to the individual employees. And it was interesting to see that, one, there were so many things that they were not aware of in terms of services available to them. And the other piece was that once the conversation started, they kind of spilled their guts in a lot of cases, and we got a lot of good information that helped us be able to solve issues that you wouldn't normally get your arms around. So it takes a lot of effort, and it takes, people that are really motivated to do that. But in the world we live in today, right, you want to be looking for all these factors so that you can get a leg up on it. Again, management responsibility, duty to warn and protect, removing the threat from the workplace. Again, Nick hit on this as well. Whether it's termination or even layoffs, when we did workforce reductions, we had to pick locations that were near exits and not near the interior of the building. And we would have, like, again, Nick said, we might have to bring in security to make sure that support was there. There's also the option to have people take what's called the Cpi De-Escalation Training. It's I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. And I'm sorry, I'll find it. CPI. I'll find it. But it's basically it's crisis prevention intervention is what it is. It's how to de-escalate. And again, my wife was certified in that because she worked in the emergency room, and so you get patients coming in. So it's something to think about trying to include in supervisory development, right? Oh, it's right there. I didn't even look. Crisis first, right underneath there. Sorry. And then notify the target, if deemed necessary. So if there's it's kind of, again, duty to protect. If somebody you have as an employee that may be a target, right? It's at the minimum notification, letting them know if they don't have any awareness of it would be appropriate to do as well. Now, workplace culture, I just want to point to really what's the culture of your organization. And it doesn't matter if it's a factory, if it's an office, but the group that you're in. And does it promote the culture of, respect, diversity of thought, right? People don't always agree on a particular topic, but do you allow others to have their time? And so let them speak. Everybody has a story to tell, right? They want to contribute in some manner, no matter how trivial they may sound, but this is where you've got to give them that opportunity to be able to share their thoughts, right? Again, I'm re-emphasizing what goes on in the organization, it's going to come from the ground up. It's really important to keep that in mind. The link here I have, which is also in your handout, is an article that I wrote for CBIA that was just framed around a couple of topics. One of the things I would encourage you to do, there's a link in that document. Stephen Covey has, and you may have heard of it, the story of the Indian talking stick. And so, you may think of it being somewhat of a goofy story, but it's really something that is important. And what I mean is giving people the opportunity to speak their mind, in a respectful way, right? Everybody, like I said, has a story. You want to get that culture because you want an open culture of reporting. That's what you're really looking for. It's that willingness and trust to give you what's going on in your workplace. And training and education is a big piece, right? Again, focus on documenting everything, especially your training records. And the last bullet here, again, critical listening skills. I would say for 90% of the environment that I'm in, it's amazing to watch how people do not have listening skills, right? Even in my own family, I can't, I try so hard to get that talking stick to run around the table and it just doesn't work. Everybody talks at the same time. But the point is here for supervisors, managers, right? Listen to what your people are saying, give them that opportunity to be respected and be heard. Okay. Run, hide, fight. Two things on this. I think everybody's probably well aware of it. Again, I put a link in here that I thought was a pretty good video. I know I'm not going to show it here. You can go look at it on your own. But when we talk about if the act, like I said earlier, right? Somebody comes in your office right now and has a gun. What's your plan? You know what I mean? Are you locking yourself in your office? Do you have the ability to do that? Is your door constructed in a manner where, you know, it's solid wood, maybe bullets can't get through it? What's the glass made out of? Do you have a place to run to? But the run piece is, the critical piece is, there's no time to waste. Some of the training will tell you, and I've got a couple I've actually got my hands on. If you hear a gunshot, you don't sit there and go, was that a gunshot? Or sort of step up and look out the door to see if it was a gunshot, if somebody's got a gun. If you hear, like I said, 5 minutes or less is the time it takes for this stuff to unfold. So you hear a gunshot, you better understand and you know what that sounds like, and you better have a plan to what you're doing about it right away, right? And some of the training, the tabletops that people will do, and again, maybe you guys have gone through it, is the police will come in and they will actually shoot a gun. I mean, obviously it's a blank, but they will shoot a gun so people understand what it sounds like. And then on the hide piece, if you're going to secure yourself, the message there is you are hiding, you're taking yourself out of being being a target, being available to be a target. And then you need to continue to move, right? You don't stay in one place unless where you're staying is secured enough to prevent that whatever the time frame that the police response will take place. And so again, 15 minutes is typical. I mean, the Texas one, I was saying to Tony earlier, blew that out of the water, but you got to keep moving. And that's why I want to talk about when you exit, if you're exiting the building, right? Evacuations from a fire, what we typically do, I use the word, we usually instruct employees to muster. We want to take and get head count. Well, when you leave because of an active shooter, you got to keep going, and the plan should be where you're going to go, right, before something like this happens. So we'll talk a little bit more about that piece on the emergency response stuff. But again, instantaneous reaction, know what you're doing, and then once you're able to stay out of the line of fire, you continue to move until you can get yourself completely safe away from anybody that's actually using a gun. The fight piece is a tough one. You know, I mean, I know some employers don't want to encourage their employees to think about doing that. So again, you have to make the choice whether or not you're going to, train people. But if you're going to be in a position where you've got nowhere to go and you think you're going to have to fight, then you better have a plan on what you're going to do. All right. Obviously, you can't bring weapons into the workplace, but fire extinguishers work pretty well. You know what I mean? And they're already there. So again, things to think about around this piece of it, right? Alice training schools. I don't have I was trying to get a little more on this. I think probably folks on this call have maybe had the training. I know my sister-in-law teaches at Wogan High School. They just went through it. A little different for run, hide, fight, right? So you can see the counter piece is interesting, where the focus is on creating noise, movement, distance, distraction to reduce the shooter's ability to shoot. But again, this is for the kids, right? And all kids are different age groups, have a different level of capability and understanding this stuff. So the school systems have a big load on their shoulders on how to protect the kids. But this is just out there, and so you can get on the website is there. You could become a certified trainer if you deem to do so. I'm trying to get myself through it as well. So I just want to put that out there for everybody to be aware. As I mentioned before, right? So for emergency preparedness, this one becomes a little difficult too. Reviewing your workplace violence plan is important for frontline supervisors. Make sure it's done routinely, but then the active shooter piece becomes interesting because the classic question is, hey, if we train all our employees what to do regarding, if somebody comes in with a gun, what happens if one of the employees that's been in the training knows exactly our plan? So I think the Columbine High School one was the kids actually used the emergency evacuation drill or the fire alarm system to lure the kids out of the school. So that risk factor is there. I mean, what I mean about establishing floor marshals, the idea is you take, and usually supervisors, managers, that they're trained into what to do, where to direct people to go, right? You don't want to necessarily document all of it so it's on paper and somebody can publish it, but you want to make sure that the infrastructure, like I'm talking to you about, is in good order. And if you're going to have people, whether they exit up or exit down, those floor marshals have to be directing that stuff at the right time. But this is never an easy discussion point because of that particular one is hard. But the one thing on the bottom, third bullet is, like I said, we're not going to muster. We want people to escape. So it's about survival. So take a look around the perimeter, the parameter, the demographics of your where you are, your buildings are, and make arrangements with neighboring businesses. So if something happens and they got to go to get out of the line of fire, they can go and they would be willing to take your employees into their facility. Or you look at what's out there for people to, there are places they can go to become concealed, where they're not. They're not a target. I can tell you, I had one site that was in Mississippi, and the story on that was that they were right next to a residential area, and they said that there was a fence around the perimeter, but the residential area had people that they didn't want you on their property, and they sat on their porches with rifles. So that's probably not a good place for you driving your people, but you got to know this stuff, right? All right, infrastructure hardening. Again, not rocket science. You guys probably are well aware of most of this stuff or all of it, but alarms and other devices, metal detectors for entrances. Obviously, cameras are critically important for monitoring areas of the plant or your facility or your offices. You have the ability to record. Safe rooms, there's a lot of criteria with regards to those. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Bulletproof glass, right? School systems design, I think a lot of the designs for them to put bulletproof glass, ballistic grade on the doors, the entrances, windows at the lower level. There is a link here that I wanted to share that does have what's called security window film. It's not going to stop a bullet, but it's something to take a look at if you think it would be helpful for reducing the ability for an active shooter to get in through a window, where they can't necessarily break the glass to get in. It's not about preventing bullets, but really good stuff in that particular bit, that link there, if you wanted to take a look at that. Emergency activation of doors, all right, this is the old, the bank teller under the button under the counter. Again, the same school I was telling you about my son-in-law was in, they were installing these notification buttons within the classrooms for teachers that went directly to the police department. So reducing the need to communicate. I mean, there's still all the stuff that they got to get there and they got to know where to go. But, and of course, you don't want a false alarm. That doesn't help, but they were actually putting those in that particular school. And then lighting, right? Lighting we talked about is how well is it? I think Nick talked about, do you have people that are working at night? And so when you go out in the parking lots, you really want to make sure your lighting is adequate. Landscape, same thing. Don't have shrubbery and all kinds of stuff around the building, around doors where people can conceal themselves, get rid of it, or go with smaller stuff. And then fencing. Technology options that are out there. I mean, I don't have a ton of detail on it, but these have been out. These were actually gunshot detection systems, have been part of the military for quite a while, but they are out there and available for potential use. Try to see if I could find some examples of actual, in usage. I mean, the facilities I've had with the company I'm at, we're not going to that level, but School systems, maybe it's more important, but that's an option for people to take a look at. Weapon detection system is now something that's out there. This was a company, if you look them up, they're out there on the web, Zero Eyes. This is, again, you can see the 5-second timeline here, right? So this one, I don't expect you to read the whole thing, but it's intended to actually use artificial intelligence, and it's tied to your existing camera systems with the ability to detect the weapon. So if somebody's walking, towards your facility carrying a long gun or carrying a pistol, it's supposed to be able to identify that right then and there and send the information directly to the police department, and it geolocates the actual person. I don't know enough if it actually will pick it up if somebody's carrying a long gun behind a long trench coat. So I actually called and talked to these guys. I wanted to see what else I could get out of them. He was not, I don't know, he's only working with certain people in terms of, I think it's more on the public sector, but it's just out there. It's a potential option from a technology standpoint, just so you're aware. Safe rooms. I got a really nice link. Again, this is the same guy that has some really good stuff. His name's Craig Gundry, but you can see the pictures on the left. This is boardrooms or executive offices where these are built in a manner with, doors, walls, and windows. They're not going to, bullets aren't coming through. So again, I know these are costs, so it may not be something that you're going to do, but the one on the right looks like a simple design. They have several different grades. This one, I kind of highlighted what they called safe classroom office delay objective 45 seconds. What that means from what I gathered was they call it 45-second frustration time. And what they meant by that is that there is no way that it's somebody that's got a gun walking around, in a school system looking for people to shoot. Once they get to a particular door or window that they can't get through, they're not going to hang around and continue to try to do that. They're going to move on to the next opportunity. So these things were designed with that type of stuff in mind. So again, if I'm thinking about the car wash that I saw that's on the list of attendees, right? If the owner of the car wash is worried about somebody getting upset about his car not being completely washed and comes in with a gun, right? His office, maybe he wants to make his office somewhat of a safe zone, safe room, right? Just so, or irate employees. It's just maybe he's got the need to do that. So opportunities to think about these types of things to install. Okay, and then of course we have the, internal notification. So if a shooter does show up and gunshot goes off, what's the notification protocol? Do you have a unique alarm system? Maybe you're a small factory and you train your employees. You get an air horn, right? Those things are loud and unique. So maybe you train your employees. If you hear the air horn, that means we got an active shooter in the building, less the sound of a gunshot. PA systems, right? Emergency buttons. And then do you have an emergency mass notification system? A lot of schools, if not all of them, have them. I think if you guys were watching the news on the northeastern in Massachusetts about I guess it's thought to have been a hoax but somebody, called in something about a bomb going off. So they had mass notification to the kids. So all the students had the information right away. So some of these are web-based apps that are not expensive. That's something to keep in mind if you don't already have that. And then, crisis communication plan, I'll talk about that in a second. Post-incident process, so lessons learned after any of these things take place, whether it's a workplace violence situation. Hopefully you never have to deal with an active shooter, but always, doing the what went right, what went wrong analysis. Very important so that you can improve all aspects of your facility's infrastructure, how you plan for it, and how you responded to it. Like I said, preparation. For a crisis communication, right? What to say, when, to who. So just again, most major corporations usually have a communication part, but something goes wrong in your facility. never mind just an active shooter. It's going to be on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter in minutes. So media shows up, they're gonna want to have some questions answered. So the one thing you don't ever do, and Nick, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but you don't say no comment, right? You want to be prepared to respond to the media. So take the time to plan for that. Have the right people identified, because you don't want employees out there going, yeah, I'll tell you what went on, right? You want to make sure you get control of that really fast. Okay. All right. So in summary, we are at 2:30, so we got time for questions. Just again, evaluate your site's exits. Really important to do that. Hopefully I stressed that enough, because those are critical, right? Preparation is key. Vulnerability assessment. You don't necessarily have to use the risk cube, but you can sit around a table and say, all right, let's talk about access control. Let's talk about how we communicate, to our employees, how we notify them, all those basic issues. But you want to have that opportunity to discuss it. Document all decisions. Work with the local law enforcement. You got Homeland Security here as an option to talk to the local police, find out what their capability is, right? What's their response time? What would be their response time if they had to come to your facility? And then how do they get in? If they have to get in a hurry, especially if you have a large plant. Engage with the employees. We talked a lot about that. They are critical to give you the information of what's going on in your world. And then you want that open culture of reporting as a result of that, so that you don't have surprises that go on because you have that, this trust or whatever the relationships between, management, supervision, and the employees. You have technological options right now. These are some of the things to think about. And like I said in the beginning, right, as unlikely as it may seem, plan as if it's a when versus an if. And just, sort of in closing, I can tell you just on the personal side, for me, I'm not, believe me, I want to practice what I preach. I have, I would say, 5 layers of protection for my home, right? And so I try to, things like I don't have the shrubbery issue. I have nothing that's on the front doors of the house. Motion detected lights. The entrances to the house are metal doors with appropriate locks. So they have view windows at the top. So if somebody breaks through the window, they're not going to reach down and unlock the door. And then if they do get in the house, I won't tell you what the result of that would be. But I'm just things that you can do, simple things like that you can do to protect yourself at home. So anyways, that's the wrap. Hopefully it was helpful. The handout you'll get has a ton of stuff in there for resources. All of it's available on the web. And Lauren, I think I added the assessment document was an embedded document there. So hopefully that comes through for the folks that are on the web. So that's it.
Great. If anyone didn't see it, there is a link to the handout via Dropbox in the chat. And Mike, there's just a couple questions here for you. I'll go through real quick. The first one would be, I work in a school and our doors lock from the outside only. Even when trying to lock under no stress, the doors are tricky to lock. My colleagues and I have received no clear response when asked what to do about this. Any advice on what steps to take in order to get this taken care of?
So they're locked from the outside, right? So that nobody can get in. And so, but it sounds like if I understand the question, right, these are the doors to the classrooms to leave the building. And the locks are hard to lock. Mm-hmm. I think if I understand the question, again, these exit doors, if they go out of the classroom, so these are probably interior doors. I'm thinking these are interior doors, right? Yeah, so it sounds like a hardware. I mean, I'm guessing it's going to be a hardware discussion on what type of door hardware that would be conducive of what you're trying to do in terms of ease of opening and closing. I think that, that's, again, for a school system, I think that's what I would probably try to do is again, local law enforcement, have them come in and help have a conversation around, access to getting in and out of classrooms, the ability to lock those. And it's really going to come down to some of the hardware that's being used that makes it easier. not having the specific, example in front of me, I can't, but I mean, again, Laura, I would encourage them. I think in the handout, I put, my contact information, so I'd be happy to have a detailed conversation if somebody wants to give me a call or send me an email to further to talk about it, to try to help.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Mike. And there's one other question then. What if you have a public building such as a public library, meaning you can't limit access? So what are you supposed to do?
Yeah, that's there's what typically what I would recommend is looking at, if somebody's in a public library sitting at a desk, right? So you want to make sure that it's configured in a way where you can see what's coming in, but there's nothing wrong with, installing barriers, right? Plexiglass or ballistic grade barriers, just like you're seeing that we've done for COVID, so that, there's a level of protection from if somebody was to come in, again, worst case has got a gun, but there's nothing wrong with looking at somehow creating that safe zone. And, from an escape standpoint, if there's an issue, again, you got to figure out where's the egress route to get out. Otherwise, where do you go to sort of protect yourself? But that I would just take a look at how public buildings are tough, but because again, you can't just totally put these people in a holding pen. But think about at least some sort of barrier protection to deflect or at least give you some time to do your response practice.
Yeah, hey, Mike, there's one other point I think you and I talked about. I think it's an important point for businesses who are thinking about doing sort of a security assessment, hiring somebody like you or a specialist to come review their facility and give them some ideas or best practices. Just make sure you have a discussion with that person, that you're engaging to give you recommendations. You want to try to be on the same page, make sure they understand what your major concerns are, what your budget is, and so you don't get a report that asks you to do something that you can't do. So if that person comes in and says build a moat, around the facility, and you don't want to build a moat, you can't build a moat. You want to be able to have a conversation, and if a recommendation is made because it's important and you can't do that specific recommendation, have a discussion about alternatives. Short of that, if you can't do this thing, then have a conversation about doing something else. So that recommendation is heeded, but just maybe done differently, that in a way that you can accommodate and afford. I think that's an important point, because you don't want to report listing 50 things and you only do 20. So have a candid conversation about that.
Yeah, no, good. Yeah, again, focus here is, it's the ability to escape and increase your chances of surviving, right? So to Nick's point, there's some things that may not give you as much of a risk reduction, but at least it's something that you can manage. So yeah, great point there. Any others, Laura?
That looks like all. Nope, that looks like all the questions that I see for now.
Okay. Great. Mike, Nick, I'd like to thank you very much. It was a host of information, and hopefully that's provided us with something that we can all utilize. Again, on behalf of CBIA and our sponsor, Carmody Torrance, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and hopefully you have a safe one. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.